Okay. I probably shouldn't be recording this, but I need to put it into perspective for some people.
The biggest booktube scandal of 2025 was the Age of Scorpius by Milo Winter, or as he was known pre-transition, AuDHD Winter. Milo started uploading TikToks about himself and his book in January 2021, trying to amass a large enough online audience to help him get an agent. In order to do that, he had to do two things. One was to sell the premise of his book, the other was to sell himself as an author. The book's elevator pitch of a Zodiac-based fantasy dystopia was already marketable enough, but Milo himself wasn't, at least not to the industry. He was still a teenager, barely 18 years old, still in high school, and still wearing braces. This would start one of Milo's worst patterns of behavior, where he would scramble to come up with anything that could make him look like a somewhat good investment, so he just spouted anything that could be sold as writing credentials. That itself carried two new problems. One, that he didn't know what actually mattered about being an author, mainly good writing, and the other issue was that he had no experience in the publishing industry and had never written anything professionally before. So Milo had to stretch pretty far to beef up his resume, and most of the stuff he listed as his experience either wasn't actually that impressive, was highly exaggerated, or filled with blatant half-truths. One claim that he made repeatedly was that he already wrote 11 books at age 18. The exact number varies from video to video, and I'm going to go into more detail about this later, but what he did here is that he counted every single draft of The Age of Scorpius as its own novel, had maybe one or two unrelated writing projects, and even then he still had to add several of his Pokemon fanfics. Another claim that wasn't as impressive as he wished was the self-publication of a previous version of Age of Scorpius called The Zodiac Turner at age 14. Don't get me wrong, it is a genuine achievement for anyone to actually finish a whole draft. Hell knows, I never had the attention span for that, but anyone can publish a book via print on demand, including a teenager. Self-publishing at that age only becomes impressive if the book is good, and The Zodiac Turner certainly wasn't, and Milo knows that.
Why is it in a cage?
Because it growled at me.
His third big claim was that at that point the Age of Scorpius had already won both a state and national award. Now, he did submit a draft of the Age of Scorpius to the Scholastic Arts and Writing Awards and was a Silver Key winner for the Greater Kansas City Writing Project 2021, so the book did win a regional award, but he never showed a national award, so either he made one up, or he counted this one as two, or he counted NaNoWriMo as a genuine writing award, which it isn't. Add to all of that he was querying agents at the same time he was also still querying beta readers, and the truth of an inexperienced and over hasty writer was already showing itself, but it's easy to say that in hindsight. Back then, his self-presentation as a passionate teenager earned him around 110,000 followers, which in turn earned him an agent by late 2021, with whom he officially signed in early 2022. Then his bubble popped. You can present yourself as a gifted kid on social media all you want, but eventually people are gonna want to see your writing. His writing wasn't good, so eventually his agent dropped him. Remember that, I'm gonna come back to it later. Now, being overconfident online is always cringe, but not criminal. Where it starts getting iffy is when other people's money gets involved. You see, Milo is, to use his own words, incredibly neurodivergent. So on May 10th, 2023, he started a GoFundMe page to raise $8,000 for a service dog, which he managed to raise by October of the same year. On this page, he claims that he can't pay for this dog himself because a miscommunicated GI Bill has forced him to drop out of college and has left him with a bunch of student loans. This claim is very interesting because a couple days later he said on his Twitter that he's just going to take a semester off to work in Alaska for a couple months, implying that he was still in college at the time this GoFundMe went up. And after Alaska, he returned to college with his service dog that he had just raised the money for based on the lie that he had to drop out of college. This is wire fraud. Also, since we're already talking about his college education, Milo joined the Colorado State University in August-September 2021. He left for Alaska in May 2023 and returned late September, early October of the same year, which means he had to take the fall semester off for that, and the Age of Scorpius would later cost him both 2025 semesters, so to this day he can only have finished a maximum of 6 full semesters, meaning that whenever he claims that he has a major or minor in anything or is even anywhere near close to finishing his degree, he's lying. Unfortunately, the lessons Milo learned throughout all of this are that lying gets you money and followers get you published. So after his agency dropped him, he returned to TikTok on November 2024 and started his entire Age of Scorpius campaign all over again, trying to present himself as an experienced writer based on trumped up credentials so people would buy into his book, gained a lot of success, and then people actually saw his writing and the bubble popped again. Only this time there were 2 new additions to his image, one of which was that he was actually self-publishing his book this time. First he tried raising the funds for that via Kickstarter, and when that didn't reach its goal, he cancelled that campaign early in mid-February and decided to self-publish with his own funds anyways. He kept posting throughout the entire publication process, and once he opened pre-orders through TikTok Shop, he kept getting pushed by the algorithm. The exact number of pre-orders that he sold is not very clear, but the 5,000 TikTok Shop pre-orders alone racked up to $130,000, and to that you also have to add ebook, Amazon, and special edition paperback pre-orders. Most of the pre-order money got spent on artwork, which he could use both in the book and as marketing material. Then he started building hype based on his hype. The second new addition to his image was public rudeness, lashing out at anyone doubting his project, one time on June 13th, 2025, even uploading a 9-minute long rant video about it.
Okay, I'm gonna be so honest, I had a much longer video recorded responding to this, but I don't want to humor you that much because you are clearly trying to get attention. You have not done any sort of research on my page, and you have just decided to go into multiple of my videos and be negative. This is not what constructive criticism is, and I know what constructive criticism is because I have been in the publishing industry for 10 years and written 10 books. I have redone the first book time and time again to find the correct place to start, the correct story to tell, the right age, all of these things, developing different characters, switching main characters. I have written book after book after book, and I have gone through the professional stages to have those books looked at. I also very much encourage you to look up Malcolm Gladwell's The Outliers. I have a lot of experience in the publishing industry. I self-published my first book at 14. At 15, I started querying literary agents. I kept doing that while rewriting books. 18 to 19 years old, I signed with my literary agency. I was with them for 3 years. At that time, I had a developmental editor look over it while I was at the agency, and my literary agent. I ended up spending 3 years there and rewriting a book 3 times, like entirely different manuscripts. I left on my own will because I decided that I wanted to defend my idea and keep my creative freedom. Hired the developmental editor who published The Hunger Games, and a copy editor with 30 years of experience at Big 5 publishing houses. I have an entire studio. I have a team. I own a 6-figure business based around this world right now. And it's because I have been so successful. They just ship. My books just shipped 5,700 books that I have sold on pre-order. As my debut, I am independent. I've run my own publishing imprint. I have a team of artists. These guys have all read the book. I have numerous artists that have read it twice. I have artists that cried at that book because of how powerful it was personally to them. These guys would not get on a call every single night and talk about this for hours straight with me if they did not enjoy it. Also, you have some audacity to get on my videos and comment about how it was not healthy for me to have this much passion and dedication for a project, how it's not normal. Babe, this is my special interest. Please, dear God, look up what a special interest is. Being not normal for something like that is simply how my brain works and many other neurodivergent individuals and autistic individuals. I think your intention is either you are projecting onto me because you have not been successful, and somebody who is successful that has gone a different route than you are jealous of. Either that or you were out for attention. And you were just solely making assumptions on my skill as a writer, and you don't have any basis for them. I became a full-time author on only pre-orders. The book isn't even out yet. Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to get on here and be able to talk about the credentials that I have, because I usually don't get the opportunity to do that because I like staying neutral about these things, but I do have a lot of experience in the writing industry. So good luck in whatever you are doing. You're a musician, maybe? I don't know. Good luck in the music field. That's even worse. That's worse than writing. And I know that because I was there at one point too. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
All of this was especially rich considering how many of his credentials were yet again exaggerated at best and blatant lies at worst. Milo did indeed hire one developmental and one copy editor, but his developmental editor did not publish The Hunger Games. She worked on marketing material for The Hunger Games back when she was employed at Scholastic UK. His copy editor did not work for Big Five publishing houses for 30 years either. She had some clients that were later published by Big Five publishing houses. Milo also doesn't have 10 years of experience in the publishing industry, so let's just talk about where he spent those 10 years at instead, and also go through the 10 or 11 books he always says he wrote. The year is 2015. On July 8th, a 12-year-old Milo created a Wattpad account for his Pokemon fanfiction. One of his friends shared the same hobby under the handle Heir to the Fortune, so on October 6th they created a collaborative Wattpad account on which they, together, wrote a story called Zodiac Awakened. If Milo wants to be at 10 years in 2025, then he must count this story as the starting point of the Age of Scorpius, and he did use this post in some of his old TikToks in 2021. Unfortunately, Zodiac Awakened has since been deleted, so I can't give you any more details on that, except that Milo and Heir are still friends to this very day. Then on August 4th, 2016, Milo created a new Wattpad account for his first own original fiction called The Zodiac Turner: The Five Trials. The account has since been deleted, so I can't give you any exact upload dates, but he probably finished the first draft between August and November 2016 and immediately started work on a sequel called The Phoenix Bracelet in December. Weeks later, on January 14th, 2017, his friend Heir started an official Instagram account for the Zodiac Turner, and 3 days later, on January 17th, Milo self-published this book via Amazon and even hosted a book signing in March. Milo is 14 years old and believes he wrote a book. After self-publishing TCT in January, Milo also published one of his Pokemon fanfics called Wind Chimes as a book 2 in April. On its Amazon page, he claims that it won the 2016 Watty Awards, but it was actually just the Pokemon Watty Awards. Within months, Milo would start rewriting the Zodiac Turner, you know, his already published novel, and recruited beta readers for it in March 2018. 5 months later, he'd start emptying his Wattpad accounts and unpublished the Zodiac Turner from Amazon in order to transition into traditional publishing. After getting the beta reader feedback, he probably started rewriting the book again by the end of 2018. On January 24th, 2019, he sent out his first query to an agent. It didn't work. Milo is 16 years old and believes he wrote a book. By August 2020, he had started rewriting the book again and finished his next draft around November, this time called The Zodiac Turner: Age of Scorpius. This is the manuscript he submitted to Scholastic, and this is the manuscript he was advertising in 2021. On January 11th, Milo uploaded his first TikTok. He is 18 years old and believes he wrote a book. Pause. We are 3 rewrites in at this point, but that doesn't mean that the Age of Scorpius was in its 4th draft now. Yes, the Zodiac Turner got rewritten a bunch, but the book also significantly changed throughout these rewrites. The Zodiac Turner is not the Age of Scorpius, it is a proto-Age of Scorpius. They're all Zodiac-based fantasy dystopias set on a fictional continent called Guardian, and they all have a wolf-loving Scorpio protagonist with the power of Zodiac turning, but the Age of Scorpius doesn't have 5 trials or a prophecy, and Gemini aren't the villains anymore. Instead, the main conflict now revolves around a Scorpio code that didn't even get mentioned in the Zodiac Turner. What happened in 2020 was a complete overhaul of the entire series, so the book Milo tried advertising to TikTok here most likely really was the first draft of Age of Scorpius. In fact, up to its very publication in June 2025, the book would never stop being in a quantum state between its first and 10th draft. The Age of Scorpius wasn't a singular catastrophe, but the culmination of a pattern of behavior 10 years in the making. The first half of which is that he keeps confusing a book's worth of writing with an actual book and immediately tries publishing it. The second half is that inevitably he doesn't get the positive feedback that he wants, so he starts rewriting it until he has a book's worth of writing again. What's especially frustrating about this is that he knows that he keeps rewriting his book, and he even knows that his previous drafts are bad, but he hasn't connected those 2 synapses yet in order to realize that he has a habit of publishing bad drafts. One factor here is that Milo has one character trait that every writer kinda needs, but paradoxically turns him into a bad writer, and that is that Milo really loves writing. When he claims that he did his 10,000 hours, that he spends multiple hours every night writing and even more daydreaming, I have no reason not to believe him. I just wish he'd stop writing new stuff when he's supposed to just edit the old stuff. And I know that this is what happened because he admitted to having added a completely new chapter that he just wrote on the day that he sent his manuscript out to the developmental editor.
So update, after almost having a full mental breakdown, because Scrivener decided that it didn't want to convert Word files, I did it and it's sent to my editor. Now, I don't know, I hope it's good, but it did drop 10,000 words. So in case anybody was wondering what my fucking revision process was like after I said I was done with this book, I still dropped 10,000 words. That is so much. And then, oh my god, I wrote an entirely new chapter today too. Why did I write an entirely new chapter, you ask? Lesbians. Bye!
Looks like we found a chapter that genuinely was published as a first draft. Milo also doesn't know how editing works. When he tried using his constant changes to plot, characters, age, etc. as a selling point in 2025, he was actually waving a huge red flag because none of your writing can be properly developed if you're still changing the outline. Editing isn't just making the book better, you also have to lock the book down. Sure, you'll start out cutting and adding chapters and shifting scenes around, but there comes a point in time when the focus shifts from what you're writing to how you're writing it, and agonizing over characters turns into agonizing over punctuation. Milo never clocked that.
I've written 9 books in this series. We're counting revisions because when I revise, I restart the entire thing.
This is also why his agent dropped him. Now, whenever Milo wanted to look like a victim of the publishing industry, he claimed that the agency had suddenly dropped all of their sci-fi and fantasy authors, and when he wanted to look like a dedicated businessman, he said that he left his agency in order to preserve his creative vision, but both are lies. Fellow Tumblr user Soul Mama actually reached out to his agent, and it turns out that Milo got dropped because he wouldn't edit. Surprise! Industry professionals can actually tell when you keep writing new first drafts instead of actually fixing your writing mistakes. It's also kind of funny that Milo tried marketing his book by saying that multiple editors looked over it while he was with his agency for 3 years and he rewrote it multiple times. But if multiple editors keep making you rewrite your manuscript for years and it never goes on submission, then that means your book isn't ready to be published yet. He also didn't spend 3 years with his agent either. She represented him for 2 years. Milo got officially signed in early 2022 and got dropped late 2023. That's important because throughout his entire marketing journey, Milo kept insisting that he had an agent for the entire 3 years he spent away from TikTok, and he decided to self-publish when they separated. There is one instance where he admits that he spent some time querying new agents, but he always presented it as if he chose not to go the trad publishing route anymore and that he wanted to go independent.
After working with a literary agency for 3 years straight, they decided to drop about 20 of their authors who wrote in science fiction and fantasy because they did not represent the genre anymore. That was not cool. I could have stayed in. Very well. I knew that, and I actually queried a couple of agents back in like August. And then it hit me that I don't want to do that. I ultimately made the decision to go indie again because I wanted to retain creative freedom over my world.
The truth is that he kept getting rejected. He had to go independent because no one would publish him purely based on the merits of his writing. And on some level, Milo knows that. He is incredibly insecure, and in that insecurity, he has found himself a way to think of himself as a good writer without having to engage with his own writing. His videos are filled with how many books he's written and how many hours he put into writing and daydreaming, and how this was his hyperfixation and special interest, and how many pre-orders he sold, and how successful his editors are, and how many artists he got, as if it was just a list of boxes to tick that would automatically make him a good writer. One of the most cringe parts of this entire saga was on February 4th, 2025, when someone questioned if counting your writing experience from middle school is actually a smart idea, and Milo answered by pulling out Malcolm Gladwell's The Outliers.
Hello, my name is Milo Winter. I'm a 22-year-old author who has been working on my series in my world for 10 years, and we're going to talk about this today. We're also going to talk about Malcolm Gladwell's theory of 10,000 hours to mastery. If you are not familiar what that is a theory obviously by Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers. Super good book. I highly recommend it. I read it in high school, and I'm willing to bet some people watching this video might have also read it in high school. He states that writing is a developed skill. It is not a natural born talent. And in order to achieve mastery, he says that one must spend 10,000 hours. I have achieved mastery according to Malcolm Gladwell's theory. Every single night since I was 12 years old, I have written for at least 3 hours. That is not an exaggeration. That is not me making stuff up. That is genuinely how I go to sleep at night. Usually I spend more than 3 hours writing. This is my special interest. So we're just gonna assume 3 hours. And like I said, this is something that matters so deeply to me that I genuinely want to spend this much time on it. We're gonna do some calculations here. Now I'm a writer, so I have a notebook where I got some help from Google. If you don't think I have the 10,000 years of hours in writing, I do definitely at least have 10,000 hours in world building. We're gonna take 10,000 hours in 10 years. I've been writing for 10 years. 10 years is 3,650 days. We're gonna take that 10,000 and we're gonna divide it by how many days that is. According to that calculation, to achieve 10,000 hours of mastery, according to Malcolm Gladwell's theory, I would have had to write 2 hours and 44 minutes every day. I have surpassed 10,000 hours. Like I said, this is something that I am intensely passionate about.
Buddy, we don't write with passion. We write with words. Also, I haven't read The Outliers, but I can tell you from experience that this kind of pop psychology is usually bullshit, rarely applies to the creative arts, and suffers from a huge amount of confirmation bias. Some skills are just more difficult than others, and not everyone has the same predisposition for them. But it's not as if Milo took the book as a standard and decided to publish once he had fulfilled its criteria of mastery. Remember, he already tried publishing his book at 14 and 18 years old when he had nowhere near 10,000 hours, and now that he has them, that still doesn't automatically make him skilled or talented. Talent and mastery aren't something you can just claim. They are awarded to you by other people based on your work, and Milo's work never stood a chance because he wasn't just a bad writer, he was also a bad publisher. When Milo originally returned to TikTok in early November 2024, he tried crowdfunding his book via Kickstarter. If he managed to raise $8,000 by February 28th, he would self-publish his book and release it in October 2025. Then it became more and more evident that his Kickstarter would most likely fail, so one fateful day on February 14th, 2025, he cancelled his Kickstarter prematurely and decided to self-publish. This announcement came with a new release date. May 2025, just 3.5 months later. Just to clarify, this book is almost 400 pages long. Later in May, he pivoted to a June release, but that was not much better either, because those were still only 4.5 months for editing, formatting, printing, and shipping a 400-page long novel. One of my best friends is an editor, and when I told her about this, she started screaming. There are several parts of the publication process that can take up months on their own, but Milo was consistently so pressed for time that even for those, he only had days to do them. After his self-publication announcement within the next couple days on February 19th, Milo found a developmental editor and started self-editing the book as well as he could himself before sending the manuscript to the editor on March 18th. He got the book back within the next 2 weeks, and by April 2nd, Milo had started implementing the developmental editor's notes. I don't know how much time exactly he took for that, but he sent the new manuscript to a copy editor within the next weeks and got it back from them by late April. Now, some of you may be thinking that from April to June 30th, Milo would still have had 2 months left to edit, but June 30th was the release date when he needed to send the book out to you, his readers and customers. But that means that he had to send the order out to the printer by May 18th. And before the book went to the printer, it needed to be formatted. Formatter Joe had to prep this book for hardcover, paperback, and ebook, and he needed to integrate a lot of artwork, so that may have taken 1 or 2 weeks as well. Once Milo got the copy editor's notes, he may only have had 1 week to implement them. I repeat, the book is almost 400 pages long. Just so you understand how bad the crunch was, a lot of the online commentary around this book is asking why it hasn't been edited more, so people look at everything else Milo did during his production and ask why he did that thing instead of editing. Why did he hire so many artists, make so many special editions, and file for an LLC instead of editing? But even if he hadn't done any of that, there still wouldn't have been any time to edit. Hell, there wouldn't even have been enough time to read this book. But the issue with his crunch wasn't just that Milo didn't have time to do things properly, he also had to make really weird decisions with the order in which he did things. Because in a production process, things don't just take time and need to be done in a specific order, they have to be done by a specific amount of time before release. Case in point, if you want your book to be available for pre-orders, you should open pre-orders a couple months before release, which is exactly what Milo did. Release was June 30th and the first order got in on April 1st. But that day he was still implementing the developmental editor's notes and hadn't sent the manuscript to the copy editor yet. As an author, you don't know how long exactly an editor is gonna take to come back to you, and you also don't know how extensive the edits are gonna be that you need to do afterwards. By April 1st, Milo shouldn't even have had a release date yet, let alone have opened pre-orders. Same with the artists. If you want to publish a very artwork-heavy fantasy novel, then you should hire enough artists to do that, and you should commission them several months before release. Milo put out a call for artists on February 19th, just after he found his developmental editor. By February 28th, he had chosen around 15, temporarily 16 artists, for which he had to look through around 500 art portfolios in 3 days. And he started commissioning these artists pretty soon. But a huge chunk of the artwork was chapter headings for all 39 chapters. But how is he supposed to know which chapters are even going to stay in this book if he hadn't even sent the book out to the developmental editor yet? This is the next lie that he told in his June 13th rant. His artists didn't read the book. What they read was a pre-edit draft of the book, because the artwork already had to be done by the time the edits were. Also, it's not your artist's or formatter's job to point out writing mistakes, because that's what you have editors for, and beta readers, or proofreaders, which he also lied about having. Some draft of this book may have been beta read in 2018 and maybe 2021, but not in 2024 or 2025, and it certainly wasn't proofread either, because there is no way that any beta or proofreader would look at this first page and tell you this is ready to go. Just to be clear here, I don't think that Milo set out to publish a bad book, but he doesn't know how to publish a good book. He can't tell the difference between stuff that sounds good in a comment section and what's actually feasible in real life. He doesn't do any research, he doesn't have an eye for detail, and he keeps cutting corners because he genuinely thinks that what's left is enough. That's why he thought he could send out a book without implementing most of the copy edits. That's why he ended up with a book full of artwork where the text isn't justified. That's why he originally set his Kickstarter goal at $8,000 in November 24, when it would turn out he needed $10,000. That's why he thought he could publish his book in 3.5 months and still have time for ARC copies. And that's why he thought he could release his book in May until mid-May, when he had already sent the manuscript to editor Joe, because that's probably when he started looking for a printer, and only then did he find out that professionally printing 5,000 books and shipping them to him can take a month. Once people saw the result of Milo's work, the bubble popped again, and it did so very publicly. The book was released on June 30th. The first 2 chapters of the first edition are still up on Patreon for free, and they're riddled with word choice errors, repetition, disjointed dialogue, bad phrasing, and stuff that doesn't fit into the world building, as well as just very confusing world building in general. Most telling is that the stream of consciousness and order of description have no regard for where the reader's attention should even be now. Even if he may have had an outline for the plot points, the prose as it is still has all the tells of a first draft where the author just writes everything down as they come up with them. Usually that gets fixed in later drafts, but that obviously didn't happen here. That made a lot of his readers wonder if the book was even edited at all, and if he's one of those authors that just don't read. Just to cover our bases here in that regard, I did find an old and abandoned Goodreads account of his, so he has at least held books in his hands in the past, but he isn't exactly knowledgeable about his subject matter, which reflects in the quality of his writing. The first 1-star review got posted on July 7th. With that, Milo's gifted kid image was gone, though he would still spend some time in denial over it, first claiming on July 9th that his prose is bad because it's supposed to be true to his neurodivergent protagonist, as if colloquial prose isn't itself a skill you need to have. Then on July 13th, he pretended that Goodreads reviews are always that bad. By the end of July and early August, he was absolutely scrambling. His entire success was built on his public image, so if he wanted to keep his career, he had to save his public image. It's just that the 5 stages of grief do not pass in a single day, and just like when he was scrambling for experience, he was now scrambling for excuses, claiming on July 30th that the wrong ebook file got uploaded as if that was the only version with issues. On August 4th, he admitted that the book was bad and announced a complete rewrite, and on August 7th, he blamed another TikToker called Tia Lewis for the backlash.
I know that a lot of times, especially with like certain medias and creative avenues, it takes one negative video to spin it out of control. A couple days ago, I was up early and I was scrolling through my For You page. I unfortunately came across a video of another author talking about me. I felt something change in me that moment. The amount of like heart dropping that I felt while watching that video will stick with me forever. And I opened these comments and there's tons of people all going, I was worried about this video was about me until you said these numbers. I just sat there for a little bit and went, how can you say that you were worried that it would be you, and then proceed to turn around and say that about another author? When I saw that video, I closed out the app and I went to my studio space and I said, I'm fucked. Up until this point, I had very positive reader reception. I was staying aware of what people were saying, and it was way more positive than negative. But when I saw this video and I saw the things that were being said, I knew, and literally within hours, I was getting dozens of comments with pure hatred.
Now, this is wrong on multiple levels. Lewis' video was about the Age of Scorpius, but it was mainly about how it's not always a good idea to just publish the first novel you ever wrote.
I believe this author fell into the pitfall that many other indie authors fall into. Let me explain. Now, being a debut author does not mean this is the first book that they've ever written and it's the first book that they're publishing. It just means that it's the first book that they've published. But what a lot of indie authors do is they write their first book, they get excited, they start talking about it online, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, and then they decide to publish that first novel that they wrote as their debut. And it was very evident that that's what happened with this book.
He didn't even mention the Age of Scorpius by name, but even if he had, it's still the right of a customer to talk about their experience with a product that they bought. Also, he had uploaded his video on July 27th, which was almost 3 weeks after the bad reviews started getting in, which I already showed you that Milo knew about. So trying to blame the backlash on a different creator after he already admitted that the writing was bad is certainly something. First and foremost, it's stupid. When people criticize you for public rudeness, the solution is not further public rudeness. When people criticize your writing, then the solution is not to shift the blame on other people. And if all your problems started with making thoughtless announcements, then the solution is not to make yet another slew of thoughtless announcements.
My name is Audra Winter, and I am going to be redoing this book.
In early August, Milo announced the second edition for the Age of Scorpius to be released in December 2025. This announcement was incredibly ambitious already, but it could have been possible if the second edition had just been a very heavy line and copy edit. He probably still had a lot of unimplemented notes from April lying around anyways. Anything more would have been impossible because between mid-August and December, you still only have 4.5 months again. Holy shit! But of course, if I tell you that something is a bad idea, you already know that Milo did it. Instead of further line and copy edits, he announced yet another complete rewrite which would keep emergency mutating in and out of ever stupider ideas that made this section of the script an absolute nightmare to structure. And the reason why this keeps happening is because, as I already showed you, Milo is apparently allergic to doing any kind of research into his projects before he starts them. That's also why he originally set his Kickstarter goal at $8,000 in November 24, when it would later turn out he needed $10,000. And since then, Milo still hadn't learned anything at all, and instead of doing any research into his new project, he just copied the language of professionals without actually understanding why they say the things they do. That started the next cycle of Milo announcing stupid stuff which eventually had to be retracted, which just eroded any public trust he still had and put even more focus on his incompetence. Milo eventually announced the second edition of Age of Scorpius as a chapter-by-chapter rewrite involving heavy input from his artists, with his goal being to finish at least one revised chapter each week, which he would at least in part upload for free on Patreon. This made the December release impossible on a mathematical level, because 1 week for all 39 chapters would have been around 9 months until March. And that is without any further developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, formatting, and printing. So eventually Milo pivoted from December to March or April, with a very optimistic option for spring 2026. Not because he had any reasonable basis to believe that it would be done by then, but because he thought it sounds good. The sounding good part is also the reason why so many of his posts either drip with fake professionalism or have him crying into the camera a bunch.
Like, everything in my life revolves around this because it's my special interest and I'm neurodivergent. This has been my thing my entire life. This is my entire branding as a human. With that passion and with the drive that I have to keep going, to not give up on this because I don't want to give up on my life.
But the release date wasn't the only problem here. A chapter-by-chapter rewrite sounds like a structured workflow on first glance, but it would mean that Milo was just starting yet another first draft the way he had for the last 10 years, and he would do so without any comprehensive outline. This would inevitably have broken both any plot structure the book could have ever hoped for, as well as the chapter-by-chapter process as a whole itself, because any deviation from the first edition in the earlier chapters would automatically make it more and more difficult to implement criticism in the later chapters. It's also a process that shouldn't involve his artists at all, but Milo thought that having more people involved would somehow make him look more professional instead of adding needless distractions. That's also why he originally claimed that he wanted to recruit his editor from the audience, as if that's him connecting with his supporters instead of adding yet another non-professional to the team. So eventually he pivoted to saying he'd hire an in-house editor, which he claims to have hired by August 18th, and said that he'd introduce to his audience as a part of his weekly FAQs. These weekly FAQs were themselves part of a larger problem. Milo wanted to put out one FAQ per week because he thought that would make him look more transparent. For some reason, at the same time, Milo also wanted to publish a minimum of 3 Patreon posts per week, featuring writing updates, world building, and artwork. This is an entire content mill's worth of output on its own, but I needed to remember that he wanted to publish 3 Patreon posts per week. At the same time, he also wanted to publish weekly FAQs and edit 1 chapter each week. Naturally, Milo had to go back on every single one of his promises, which made him look even worse than before. The Patreon output probably had its reduction in October be the least painful, but the same did not apply for the updated chapters. Posting those for free had always been a bad idea because it added even more pressure, meant publishing yet another slew of premature drafts, and was also just generally a bad business decision. If you want to sell a product, you shouldn't put it online for free. Milo posted the revised chapter 1 on August 24th, and because, of course, it wasn't very good, people started criticizing it. So a week later, he decided to ban anyone who would still comment on it instead and announced that only chapters 1, 2, and 3 would be uploaded at all, though in reality, the second chapter would continue to be postponed into cancellation. Again, I already told you that this kind of rewrite has always been unfeasible and delays do happen, but the fact that his writing kept getting delayed right into cancellation while the artwork and world building stuff still got uploaded was certainly a bad look. The FAQs also got cancelled. He uploaded the first on August 11th, and then the general update on August 18th was an announcement of an FAQ with his in-house editor Caitlin. That apparently got uploaded on August 25th, but since editor Caitlin just started bashing the other editors and other random authors that had nothing to do with the drama, the interview got received so badly that Milo ended up deleting it and never did any FAQ ever again. Caitlin's unprofessionalism also opened up the question of whether she even exists at all or is just one of Milo's sock puppets. And to be honest, I also don't believe that she exists either, though not because of the unprofessionalism. Unprofessional editors do exist. What I found most telling about Caitlin is that I couldn't find anything about her. You'd think that a professional editor would at least have a LinkedIn page or a Facebook account or just any account at all, but the only things that exist about her are this deleted interview, a couple mentions by Milo's team, a couple posts on Milo's Patreon, and one Substack article which didn't even exist until January. This Substack article is also incredibly badly written. It doesn't form any coherent argument, is entirely unstructured and disjointed, and misrepresents several terms from Aristotelian rhetorics. It doesn't seem like something a seasoned writer or even an LLM would write, but it is very similar to the writing style of a certain wannabe author who has issues with order of description and is trying to sound smarter than he is. The Patreon posts have the same issues. But it is very telling about just how badly Milo had ruined his reputation at that point if he can't even post an unrelated interview without people immediately calling bullshit. This didn't just affect stuff where he genuinely messed up, but also influenced the reception of everything else. Even stuff that was technically neutral ended up being a very bad look. In mid-August, Milo released one last reintroductory video and went off of TikTok until early November, and his Patreon had been run by Elros for a while at that point too. Since Milo was very bad with social media and making announcements over social media, handing that off to other people was probably a good idea, but building his entire audience on his own face and then leaving during a crisis while pushing yet more work onto his artists did leave people disapproving, especially since the public communication since then hasn't been stellar either, and there are some announcements that just look better if you pretend you wrote them yourself. Another thing was his 3-month-long trip to Finland to hang out with his artistic director Sauli Rauhala, during which he went offline for a month. People are allowed to go on holiday, even in Europe, but the fact that he did so while already delaying the second revised chapter looked bad, and when he came back he did so with an essay called High Disturbance, still no chapter 2, and a whole new identity. At this point people were also starting to dig up his multiple author pseudonyms. Now, going through multiple pen names when you are young is not suspicious or noteworthy, especially when most of them were created as a teenager. To be honest, I'm juggling way more accounts than he is, and I'm also better at covering my tracks. People who genuinely try to change their identities do not publicly acknowledge their old identities or announce their new ones on their old accounts. It is also not intrinsically suspicious to come out as trans in your early 20s while on a trip through Europe, or to accidentally choose a pen name that's already occupied. When Milo came out as transmasculine, he chose the name Milo because it derives from the word miles, which is Latin for soldier, and Milo is a military brat. But when combined with the last name of his pen name, you get Milo Winter, which is also the name of a dead children's book illustrator. Again, this kind of stuff happens all the time. There is no name untaken. When I chose my own pen name to publish my poetry under, I picked that based on an old nickname and a personal interest. And then, a couple months later, when I was already published in a journal and had held a couple readings, I found out that there's another author with the same name who publishes erotica a couple cities over. And I still haven't found a way to solve this issue, and all that I can do now is to just hope she never notices and wait until she dies. The only reason why Milo's name changes were an issue was because he had already crossed the lol cow event horizon, where people will criticize anything you do. I have seen these same commentators who told him to go offline then turn around and accuse him of taking the money and running away when he did go offline for a while, only to then turn around again when he did come back. This also worked in tandem with some misconceptions that a lot of people had about the entire disaster around Age of Scorpius. Those are inevitable in any large online drama with a lot of speculation, but in Milo's case, those were a direct consequence to stuff he had said himself. One of the most common pieces of advice that Milo got is that he should try writing anything other than the Age of Scorpius, because only writing this one thing is not exactly good for anyone's writing journey. The truth is that the Age of Scorpius, or his fantasy world, the world of Guardian, is not the only project he had. He had some other story called Villainous in 2020, tried his hand at a contemporary fiction once, and in 2021 he tried starting a different fantasy series too. The reason why people thought that Milo only wrote his Zodiac books is because that's how he presented it. Both during his marketing and during the backlash, he went all in on this being his unum opus, and his other projects never got mentioned again.
When you have a failure, you're encouraged in the industry to just start something else. And I've never been able to do that.
This has been my thing my entire life. This is my entire branding as a human.
I will only write in the world of Guardian.
His self-presentation during his marketing also became an issue. After getting dropped by his agent, Milo properly returned to TikTok in November 2024 when he first tried marketing off the Trump election with some pagan stuff thrown in. Then Congress almost banned TikTok and the algorithm didn't play along, so he started crying into the camera a bunch.
Okay, I probably shouldn't be recording this, but I need to put it into perspective. For some people, I think it's important to see both the good and the bad of talent.
Then he started self-publishing and the pre-orders came in, and Milo got very excited about being a business owner now.
I own a 6-figure business based around this world right now.
Especially the last switch from pity marketing to girl boss bragging has been so drastic that it has left a weird taste in some people's mouth about how authentic it was and how staged the entire thing may have been. And don't get me wrong, there is a lot of performativity involved here, as it is with most social media. Just think about how many things he had to set up just to get this shot. But that doesn't mean that the emotions behind that were fake. Quite the contrary, actually. Milo's output in April and May is the most genuine and unfiltered image you can get of what it feels like to be more successful than you thought you could be, faster than you should be. I can tell you from experience, it absolutely fries your brain. Seeing his book get so much pretty artwork and getting hundreds of affirmations every video and selling thousands of pre-orders must have been a level of prolonged euphoria that Milo will never feel again, even on his wedding day. Add to that the stress of a 4-month book publication and the accompanying sleep deprivation, and the result is a skull full of scrambled eggs. There is nothing left to lobotomize here anymore. Of course, it was jarring for the audience to witness because it was jarring to live through. Even more so with the shock of a public backlash.
From the time that I listed that pre-order and the time that I established an LLC was 2 weeks.
Another matter of bad looks was Alter Life, which is a poetry collection that Milo published on Amazon and a couple European sites on December 19th and started advertising on his platforms on December 23rd. I have already uploaded an entire video on that before, and I will talk about it further in a later section, but for now I just want to focus on its optics. on a page-per-day basis. Writing poetry takes much longer than writing prose, but once your poems are written, publishing them is actually much faster than publishing a novel, because poetry doesn't get edited the same way that novels do, because you're dealing with multiple texts where you already edit some while others aren't even written yet. Poets also have much more creative freedom and creative control over their work. The only external input you usually get is from friends and feedback groups. When a poem sees a professional editor, it is usually one working at a journal whose only job it is to accept or decline your text as it is. Dedicated poetry editors that actually work on your texts with you are incredibly rare and usually tied up in specialized publishing houses. When it comes to self-published poetry, 99% of what's out there has never seen an editor at all. I'm sorry to say this, but Milo actually did a book thing the usual way. He had a pile of poems that he wrote over several years, chose a couple to put into his anthology, and sent it off to his illustrator. Usually after assembly, I'd still give a poet a couple weeks, if not months, for agonizing over the last line edits, but fortunately for us, this is Milo Winter, so we already know that these poems didn't get edited. We actually have footage of one of them being written, and it was still the same in 2025 as it was in 2024. After Milo assembled these texts, he sent them to Elros for a spell check and gave them to Sauli for the illustrations. I don't know how long Sauli and Elros took for that exactly, and whether Milo still made changes to the texts in the meantime, so Milo might barely have had a couple of hours of work away from Age of Scorpius. But how many people know that kind of stuff? When Milo published Alter Life, he had already delayed the second revised chapter for 4 months, so of course it looked like he had wasted months of editing time for this book instead. In reality, it was the other way around. The second chapter didn't keep getting delayed because he started working on Alter Life. Milo started working on Alter Life because the second chapter kept getting delayed. Again, I'll talk about it more in the crime section. Also, I already said that Milo's time pressure during the original production of Age of Scorpius was so bad that hiring less artists and releasing less special editions wouldn't actually have made the book better, but if you're neglecting the most important step in the publishing process, namely editing, then you shouldn't brag about all of the extras that you're doing, because it's going to be a bad look in hindsight. And if you're already looking bad for doing other stuff instead of editing, then releasing an entirely new book in a genre where people don't edit, when you're supposed to edit the Age of Scorpius, is the dumbest decision you could make, because now people were criticizing him for wasting editing time, and he can't even defend himself with the truth of how quickly Alter Life was probably published, because that's him publishing premature drafts again. Because Alter Life isn't good either. But a month before Milo published Alter Life, he published an essay called High Disturbance on November 10th, where he generally talked about his mental health, climate change, came out as trans, still didn't apologize to T.L. Lewis, tried blaming the entire disaster on the pre-order chaos and his copy editor, and revealed that he hadn't actually read his own book before he published it. Now, when the essay came out, I already had a rough idea of what this calendar looked like, so the last part didn't surprise me at all, but it is still a bit outrageous. What's also outrageous is that this essay, where he's supposed to come clean, is still full of lies. The way that he presents the build-up to the backlash and the second edition is that he thought the book was fine when it came out. Then on July 28th, he watched the T.L. Lewis video, got enraged, read his book again, and only then did he notice how bad it was. But that's not how it happened. Milo announced the second edition on his TikTok on August 4th, but he had already published the first 2 chapters of the first edition on Patreon with a huge banner saying original version not revised on July 30th. And before that, Sauli was already publishing cover explorations for the second edition on July 29th and 26th. which was a day before Tia Lewis even published his video or Milo saw it. Wait, let's do a calendar here. The first edition of Age of Scorpius was released on June 30th, 2025. On July 7th, the first bad review was posted. 2 days later, Milo tried pretending that his prose was bad because his protagonist is neurodivergent. On the 13th, he pretended as if all Goodreads reviews are this bad at the beginning. On the 18th, he published a post on his Patreon claiming that every line of his prose is carefully structured. By July 26th, he had started work on the second edition, and only 1 day after Sauli had already posted the first sketches of the new cover, had Tia Lewis even posted his video, and only 1 or 2 days after that had Milo watched it. On July 30th, he already uploaded the first edition chapters on Patreon
and still claimed publicly that only the wrong ebook file got uploaded.
On August 4th, Milo announced his second edition officially on TikTok and admitted that his book wasn't up to par. And 3 days later, he still sent his audience after Tia Lewis just for shits and giggles? And somehow, all of this is still not as outrageous as what he tried doing with his copy editor here. In High Disturbance, he claims that the reason why his edits were insubstantial is because his copy editor did a bad job, and that Reedsy, the platform that he used to hire his editors, started an investigation into his copy editor on their own while he didn't know anything about that yet. But this is not what happened. Fellow YouTuber Meredith Novaco actually got in contact both with Reedsy and the editors, and their story was a tad different from what Milo said here.
I asked Reedsy, did you initiate it of your own accord, or was it requested? Reedsy says, yes, it happened in September of this year at the request of the author. According to the platform, Milo reported these editing passes and wanted them looked at and wanted a refund. When I asked what the result of the investigation was, they said that neither Reedsy nor the third-party editors found any faults with the developmental edit work. To the contrary, the work was praised by all third-party editors who looked at it and confirmed what the developmental editor had told me when I reached out to her for my last video, which was that the editor did tell Milo that the manuscript was not ready for publishing and needed a lot more editing. Bear in mind, Milo has said stuff publicly that contradicts that. Milo has claimed at points that both the editors signed off on this manuscript and said it was ready for publishing. Then they started to talk about the copy editor. Here's what they said. While the copy editor did a lot of work on the manuscript, there were still a high number of missed errors and inconsistencies. For example, with capitalization, our assessment overall was that the manuscript needed a second developmental edit with focus on inline edits, or at least a very heavy copy edit, while the work from the copy editor was more of a very heavy proofread. Additionally, the author had mentioned to the editor early on that their intention was to have a publishing-ready manuscript after this copy editing pass. Given that context, we believe it would have been important to inform the author that the manuscript was not publication ready after the copy edit. So that's what the platform said. When I spoke to the copy editor, she told me that basically the second she found out that Milo was unhappy with her work, she was happy to provide a refund. And that is corroborated by the platform inadvertently. I hadn't even asked them about that because I reached out to them at the same time. But the platform said, as a result, we decided that there were grounds for a refund for the copy editing collaboration. That said, as we reached out to the copy editor about this, they offered to refund the author in full themselves. I have always worked on the basis that if an author tells me they are unhappy with my work, I'd be happy to offer a refund in full. As a result, the author did receive a full refund for the copy editing collaboration, and for that one only. She also did say that the feedback that she got from the website deemed the edits given were all correct, but that Milo's manuscript required more extensive edits as well. Upon reflection, I also agree with their assessment. All of that to say that the platform did decide to refund Milo. So even though the editor offered the refund and was happy to give the refund, the platform did the investigation anyway and did find that a refund was deserved. I want to come back to my point that it doesn't matter. It's not the copy editor's fault that the book was in the form it was in. You, the author, should have realized it wasn't ready for publishing.
Also, let's not delude ourselves. Milo already thought that his book was ready to be published before he even hired his editors in the first place and set a way too tight deadline to properly edit anything. He only had a couple of weeks to implement the developmental edits and only had 1 or 2 weeks to implement the copy edits. That's not enough time to properly edit anything, let alone 400 pages of Age of Scorpius. Even if he had the best copy editor in the world, he still wouldn't have been able to implement the necessary edits in time for the release. And after all the times he talked about how great his editors are, how much he respects them, and used their experience to advertise his book, trying to immediately put the blame on them when things went wrong and throwing his copy editor under the bus like this is some of the most underhanded behavior I have ever seen. And it's not as if Milo saw their copy edits, found them to be bad, and then ordered a refund. He was perfectly willing to use their suggestions for his book, then called everyone who called the book bad a bully, and then he turned around, making every excuse possible, trying to shift the blame for his book being bad on anyone but him, because he just can't admit that something went wrong because of him. I don't like the way he talked about the pre-order chaos either. Yes, managing several thousands of pre-orders in 2 months does take time away from editing, which is why you shouldn't open pre-orders at that stage yet. But who did this? Who set him on this timeline? Who made him start self-publishing right after his Kickstarter failed? Who made him announce his book for just 3 and then 4 months later? Who made him hire artists before the book was even through his self-edits yet? Who made him open pre-orders when he was still implementing developmental edits? Who made him raise the daily limit on TikTok Shop from 50 to 100 when he was already getting sleep deprived? Who made him sell a special edition when the first edition wasn't even out yet? Who made him start a second edition? Who made him do a complete rewrite instead of a copy edit? And who made him set the release date for that in December and then spring when either's way too early?
Who did this to you?
I think it's important to see both the good and the bad of talent.
This is where I have to talk about Milo's neurodivergency. Our dear subject here has always been very open with the fact that he has both ADHD and autism, shortened to AuDHD. But Milo seems to be under the assumption that that's some kind of superpower and not a self-compounding combination of disabilities. To be clear, neither ADHD nor autism make you a bad writer who lies about the credentials and bullies anyone who criticizes them, but there are other factors in this saga where it's not a coincidence that they came from someone with this combination of mental disorders. ADHD and autism can manifest in very individual ways, but they're both diagnoses that heavily affect your brain regulation, including your emotional regulation and impulse control. ADHD impulsiveness does not magically stop when it comes to making business decisions, and once it comes to that, dopamine-seeking behavior can overlap very heavily with grifter behavior, because you get a new idea, get very excited about it, and make a ton of promises while simultaneously suffering from time blindness and neglecting important parts of the production process that don't give you immediate positive feedback, all of which automatically sets you up for failure, leaving you in a slump that makes your brain start dopamine seeking again. That's the cycle underlying his 10 years of premature publications. That's the cycle underlying the entire catastrophe. Milo specifically runs on a 3-month dopamine-seeking cycle. He he started acquiring for a new agent in August 2024. After 3 months of failure, he went on TikTok again in November, setting up a Kickstarter for his self-publication without rebuilding his audience first. When that failed, he ended his Kickstarter in February 2025 and started a self-publication timeline so ludicrous that it covered both this and the next cycle. After his book failed, he announced an impossible rewrite in August. After the difficulties with that became apparent, he moved to Finland for a while and both published High Disturbance and started another project that I'm gonna talk about in the crime segment in November. During this entire time, the World of Guardian LLC was rapidly bleeding money, both for Milo's living expenses, the storage apartment for his special editions, the tens and thousands of dollars of artwork in his books and on Patreon, etc. In High Disturbance, Milo admits that he hadn't put aside any money and that he put all 6 figures back into his business. Read, he blew it on artwork. This brings us to the topic of his artistic studio. Throughout his TikToks and High Disturbance, Milo claims that he had either 15 or 16 or 20 plus artists working under him. He mentions 16 of them by name in his TikToks, but one of them jumped ship early, so he credits 15 of them in the special thanks of his book. I don't know how he got to 20, but he was also just impulse contacting new artists in May and June, including a composer. This may be connected to a bunch of other projects he was dreaming up at the time, like an audiobook, merchandise, a TTRPG, and illustrated booklets of every chapter, but naturally all of those ideas went down the drain after the initial backlash. It is also not clear how these artists got paid. On his call for artists on Reddit, it seems like he was going to pay them on commission, but he also repeatedly claimed that some were employed. On one occasion, he said that he also wanted to pay his artists royalties for the book. On another one, he claimed that the chapter booklets would have a 50-50 royalty split.
In fact, when we do sell these little booklets, we're going to do an even royalty split. So half of it is going to be to me and half of it is going to be to my artist, as well as some to our formatter, Joe.
So I'm not sure how much money everyone got for the work by the end, and we'll probably never find out because of a possible NDA, but the entire thing was probably incredibly expensive. After the book was released, half the team signed off and Milo went to continue working on a second edition with a team of 8 people, but since the money dried out, he tried crowdfunding for $70,000 on an angel investors website where he claimed that he wanted to set the path for a new literature-based genre of art consumption, as if that hadn't already been a thing for thousands of years at this point. Fortunately, that fell through when he deleted the campaign after the public got wind of it. By October 9th, the only people left on his team were himself, Elrose, Sauli, and maybe editor Caitlin if she ever existed. In December, his artistic director Sauli also jumped ship. On February 21st, Milo finally cancelled the entire project. The way that a friend of mine who also has AuDHD explained it, dopamine can also come from ridding yourself of a project that has brought you nothing but pain in the past. But what even was the project? Milo's entire fantasy world is called the World of Guardian. Within that world, the Age of Scorpius was supposed to be the first of a franchise that would at one point have possibly encompassed 4 or 7 books in the main series, and there were even plans for a pre- and post-series. The Age of Scorpius as we got it is actually a very simple book. We have a protagonist, Rika Spring, who lives under an oppressive regime and goes on a MacGuffin hunt for a thing that could help her overthrow this regime. On the way, she makes friends with like-minded people, uncovers the hidden history of her world, her own past, and saves and reunites with her one true love. All of this sounds way better when I summarize it than when you read it. In the actual book, plot points are barely connected, party members are just picked up by chance or randomly decide they're part of this adventure now, and a huge chunk of the world building is simultaneously over-convoluted and underdeveloped. The MacGuffin can only be accessed through a secret city with a magical barrier that doesn't let anyone enter except if they're descendants from specific bloodlines, but since all of our characters stem from those bloodlines anyways, this barrier ends up being more of a joke than than anything. The first chapter spends a lot of time setting up the mystery of Conviction Woods, a forest cursed to murder anyone who enters it, but not only is this mystery entirely irrelevant to the plot, but almost every character we meet ends up being immune to this curse anyways. There's a lot of yapping about the world's government systems, but key points like how the Scorpio Code is supposed to help the Scorpio government even stay in power at all are entirely left out. Everyone constantly worries about the concept of magical balance, but no one knows what it even is. The worst offender is probably the magic system. People with different zodiac signs have different superpowers, but every sign can also have one of multiple powers, and some powers are available to multiple signs. Then there's also genetics involved. Some characters have primary and secondary magic, and since multiple of our characters are zodiac turners, a lot of people just end up switching signs and randomly unlocking new powers too. There are so many rules and caveats here that everything feels completely random, while Milo's bashing you over the head with his info dumps, insisting that this is totally a hard, rule-based magic system. You just don't get it. There is a reason for that. You see, when I was a teenager, I had my very own world of Guardian. In my case, it was a superhero fantasy called Born, and it was heavily inspired by the Parahuman series. I had ideas for characters and costumes and superpowers and team-ups and one or two plot moments, which usually centered around how which character would die because I was still an edgy teenager. But do you know what I didn't have? A story. Because this world wasn't made to host a story. It was made to host my brain when I was bored in math class. The story could change to whatever I thought would be cool at that moment. The characters weren't characters, but more akin to imaginary friends, and the world building itself kept endlessly changing as any new idea I ever had could be grafted onto it. There is a non-zero chance that on different halves of the world, Milo and me simultaneously sat in biology class, learned what recessive and dominant genetics are, and immediately brainstormed ways to work that into our magic system. The result was an absolute monstrum made out of characters that got added last week and story beats from since before I got braces. This is normal. Any writer goes through a phase like this. Baby's first fantasy world usually sucks. All that matters is that it's fun. But trying to make a good story out of any of that would take a decade's worth of distance and hindsight, and within that distance and hindsight, you have to realize that there is a difference between having a lot of ideas and having good ideas, and that there is also a difference between having ideas and having a story. Milo never realized that. The world of Guardian is Milo's first fantasy world. He had been working on it since he was 12, and in the 10 years since then, he kept adding new ideas, characters, and world building. This is how you end up with this mess of a magic system, generations worth of bullshit, and a fantasy setting that is also a post-apocalypse, even though it really doesn't need to be. That is also how Milo ended up writing books 2 to 6 simultaneously, while he still hadn't nailed down what even goes into book 1, and why the contents of book 1 still kept changing too. This is why the revised chapter 1 included a moss zombie deer that wasn't even in the first edition, but was in Milo's very first TikTok from January 11th, 2021. Milo claims that he kept rewriting and changing the book to find the right place to start, the right story to tell, the right age, developing different characters, switching main characters, because he wanted to find the best way to tell his story. But it's the other way around. The story didn't keep changing because it's what's most important. The story kept changing because it was entirely secondary to the notebooks he wanted to chase through. It's the world of Guardian, not the story of Guardian. And that is just the neurotypical extent of it. In Milo's case, there may be a dozen other factors at play here, like this world possibly being a coping mechanism for trauma and or an autistic paracosm that became a foundational part of how he deals with the world, and or an ADHD hyperfixation that he genuinely couldn't separate from for 10 years. Then there's also his self-image and self-mythologization that would fall apart anytime he had to engage with his own writing, his inexperience, his panic lying, all of which is already disabling in private, and in public results in the kind of disaster you can take as it is and throw it onto a Freitags pyramid. The reason why I started research into this entire drama in the first place is because there are a lot of points in which I could emphasize with Milo. But, and this is also important, there is a difference between being an inexperienced teenager and being an adult dealing with over $100,000 of other people's money. And this is where I have to talk about all of the crimes that Milo committed. I already talked about Baby's first wire fraud with his service dog Smidge, but the consistency with which he knowingly lied about himself and his book in order to get people to donate to his Kickstarter and pre-order his book that he profited from could be its own case of wire fraud. That is, unless he's officially too stupid to fulfill the mens rea requirement, though even if that was the case, each of his lies is also a violation of the FTC's truth in advertising rules. Those are not the only kind of FTC violations he committed. Most important here is the FTC Section 435, the Mail, Internet or Telephone Order Merchandise Rule. I am going to show you a lot of legal jargon now, but the principle behind all of this is actually pretty simple. Whenever a customer orders and pays for something online, then they should be able to expect that they will get that product, and they should get it within a reasonable amount of time. Everything else logically follows from that. For example, section 435.2 paragraph A1. A seller is only allowed to open pre-orders for a product if they can get that product to their customer by a specific amount of time, meaning either within 30 days after the order is placed or at a specific release date. That means that the seller is only allowed to choose a release date where they have a reasonable basis to believe that they can actually deliver that product. When Milo opened pre-orders for the Age of Scorpius on April 1st, he did so claiming that the book would be out in May, even though he had no reasonable basis to believe that the book would actually be out at that time. And he didn't push the release back to June until mid-May. My crash out from almost an hour ago about Milo believing he could publish a 400 book in 3.5 months is actually legally relevant here, because reasonable basis to believe is a deliberately vague term, but if a simple Google search can tell you your production schedule isn't possible and anyone even approximate to the industry starts screaming with terror, then you have no reasonable basis to believe in your release date. So Milo already committed his first FTC violation the day he opened pre-orders. Then there's also the question of what he opened pre-orders for. Back in April, the TikTok Shop pre-orders were for signed hardcover copies, but in early May he changed those to TikTok Shop exclusive limited editions, which isn't necessarily a change to the product, but it is a change to the nature of the product after several thousand people had already pre-ordered it. In his case, he's lucky it was an upgrade, but you should just generally be careful with that kind of stuff. Another thing he kept doing is continuously increase the pre-order ceiling and then siphoned off 200 copies of his TikTok Shop exclusive edition to sell on his own website too. If anyone bought the book for its limitation-based resale value, then that's also false advertising. Another false advertising charge here is about the features of this special edition hardcover, because in May he claimed that those would have sprayed edges and then retracted that in June, so that's also false advertising. He also claimed in April that he was opening pre-orders for limited edition posters too, and since then I've seen neither hide nor hair of those. But let's get back to our mail, internet or telephone order merchandise rule. As I already said, in mid-May Milo delayed the release release of the Age of Scorpius from May to June 30th. These delays come with certain legal obligations, i.e. you have to notify your customers that their product is getting delayed. You can't just put out a post on TikTok and hope your customers see it. Section 435.2 paragraph B1. If you delay your product, then you, the seller, have to actively notify each and every one of your customers yourself. I'm not sure if TikTok Shop has a contact all option for this, but otherwise Milo himself would have had to make sure that he reaches out to all 3,000 customers individually, not only notifying them of the delay and the new release date, but also giving them the option to either consent to the delay or get a prompt refund, meaning within 7 business days. If he didn't reach out to them, then that's another FTC violation. Though if he did, then Milo is fortunate enough that June 30th is barely within 30 days after the original release, so according to section 435.2 paragraph B1-2, he would have been allowed to deem any non-answer as consent to the delay. If it was over 30 days, he would have to deem any non-answer as a demand for a refund. Remember that, we're gonna get back to that later. Now, when Milo originally delayed the release to June, the first concrete date he gave was June 30th, and the book was indeed released on June 30th, so at least that was not another unreasonable shipping date, whatever that's worth. But for some reason, on May 31st, he claimed in his video description that the book would not be delayed past mid-June, so that's another false advertisement. Then there's also the issue of how Milo processed his pre-orders. Now, due to the way that TikTok Shop pre-orders work, Milo wasn't technically allowed to open pre-orders for his book 2 and then 3 months before release, so what Milo did is offer the book on pre-order via TikTok Shop, and then after he got the order, he'd send out a bubble mailer with a note and a bookmark to the customer, so he could mark the order as fulfilled, while the customer would only get their book at the actual release date weeks if not months later. Now, marking an order as fulfilled while it hasn't actually been could be seen as a deceptive business practice and yet another FTC violation, but even if you disagree, because Milo has communicated the actual release date everywhere else and other authors are also doing this, it is still a shitty business practice, because the moment your order gets marked as fulfilled starts the countdown for TikTok Shop's 90-day money-back guarantee, and once that's over, your refund is in the hands of the likes of Milo Winter. It makes you very vulnerable to scammers. I'm not sure if Milo did the same bubble mailer thing for the second edition pre-orders too, but that edition has its own bunch of FTC violations. When Milo originally announced its release for December, he was yet again giving a release date with no basis in reality. When Milo pushed that release back to spring, he was giving a delayed release date with no basis in reality. But also, that is yet another delay, so now he would have to contact each and every single one of his customers again, and since spring is more than 30 days after December, any non-answer to these notifications would also have had to be automatically deemed a demand for a refund. Same with the cancellation, by the way. Also, even though Milo changed the second edition announcement from December to spring in his TikToks as early as mid-August, his website was still promising a December release as late as October. But let's be honest, there weren't a lot of people pre-ordering the second edition anyways. There was a much larger payload he had to protect. You see, back in spring 2025, before the Age of Scorpius had been released, he wasn't just selling this limited edition hardcover. From late May, early June onwards, he was also selling limited edition paperbacks. This limited edition would have included more artwork, sprayed edges, and 2 additional chapters, which is why it wouldn't have been released with the other books in June, but in September-October 2025. According to his own self-report, Milo sold 2,000 copies of those paperbacks, and once the bad reviews of Age of Scorpius got in July, every single one of those customers had very good reason to ask themselves if they still wanted those books and if yes, whether they would ever get them. One thing that Milo kept doing in his communications were these weird "I'm not giving up yet" speeches.
But I don't give up. Every single thing in my life revolves around this, and I am ready to stand and fight for it. I can continuously push through difficult things, and I'm going to. Now I can get up, and I can go back at it stronger, and I can rebrand and do all these things, and I'll sacrifice everything that I need to in order to just give my stories to other people. People don't see the toll that takes on somebody. I would die before I gave up on this thing. I'm not dying yet. I'm not dead yet. And I am not going to give up on it either. Every waking hour and minute goes to this. So let's try this one more time.
They sound like something a cartoon protagonist would say, and every time I was wondering what this is even supposed to be a call to action for, but then I realized that at that point there was still around $40,000 up in the air here, and whenever he gave one of those speeches, introduced his great plans for a second edition, and then blamed it all on T.L. Lewis anyways, then the communication these paperback customers would have received was, "Please don't order a refund, you're still definitely going to get your book." The punchline is that they were never going to get their book. They ordered first edition paperbacks, and any work on anything first edition got cancelled once Milo started brainstorming for a second edition in late July. What he tried doing is sell his paperback customers on the idea that their book would be updated with the second edition text as well, but that is a significant change to a product that they already paid for. The book had its entire content switched out. That's a substitution, and in order to do a substitution for a pre-ordered product like this, you'd need explicit permission from your customers to do this, otherwise that's a refund. With the change from first to second edition, the release of those paperbacks was also pushed back to whenever the second edition in general would have been released. So when Milo announced the December release, that would have delayed the paperback release from October to December too. So Milo would have to contact every one of his customers again and ask them permission for this delay in the first place. And since this is a 30-day plus delay, any non-answer would have to have automatically been deemed a refund too. The same spiel would have to have happened again when he pushed from December to spring. And just like with the second edition in general, when the project got cancelled, it became Milo's responsibility to automatically issue refunds. It is not up to these customers to keep up with the Milo Winter drama on his pages and then fill out a refund form. It is up to him to actively reach out to his customers and give them their money back promptly, and prompt refund means within 7 working days. Any comment section on Milo's page is filled with people who tried reaching out to him or Elros or already filled out forms and haven't received anything yet. The answer they get is always to send the team a DM and, "Oh, we're trying our best," but the fact that these people even have to reach out this way is already kinda outrageous, because when it is your customers that have to reach out to you, then there's always people that miss the announcement or have given up trying to get anything out of Milo already. And I think Milo knows that, and he's relying on it. Remember, he himself already admitted that he blew through his money when the pre-orders stopped getting in July and August. And by September, he tried begging angel investors for $70,000 and snitched on his editors on Reedsy trying to get a refund from those. And in November, he got another idea. You see, Milo has a business. 2 actually. When he opened pre-orders for the first edition hardcovers back in April, he was getting a lot of traction. So in mid-April he started speaking to lawyers, and on April 30th he officially registered the World of Guardian LLC, which he is the single owner of. This is a perfectly normal thing to do. In April, Milo had already sold 1,500 pre-orders, which would have been over $30,000 in 1 month. We never got a rundown of how many copies of which which edition were sold exactly, but he most likely really did make between $150,000 and $200,000. That is an amount of money where you should really start thinking about taxes, especially if he also commissioned artists for the book and handled printing and distribution himself, and also had to rent an entire apartment just to store the merchandise. I'm not sure if starting a company would help with any of that, but I would at least start talking to people. I'm actually kinda glad he did that rather sooner than later. But I mentioned Milo has 2 businesses. When he was in Finland on November 6th, he registered a new company, the World of Guardian LLP. Now, if a limited liability company is there to protect the owner from the company's bullshit, then a limited liability partnership is there to protect the owners from their partner's bullshit, including financial bullshit. The World of Guardian LLP has 2 partners. One is Milo Winter. The other is the World of Guardian LLC. The World of Guardian still owes people money, and Milo knows he can't pay. Now, that doesn't mean that whatever Milo's trying here is going to work. This entire construct is not nearly complex enough to not get immediately veil-pierced, and Milo's paperwork is giving me the weird vibe of not being filled out correctly, but I'm not knowledgeable enough in American business filings in order to point out why I think that. But just because his attempt might not succeed doesn't mean that the attempt itself, the existence of this company, isn't already suspicious, especially when I tell you that Milo doesn't owe the cancellation refund since the product got officially cancelled, but ever since he started having reasonable doubt that he'd be able to release in spring. Even a Milo Winter doesn't just wake up one day with a divine revelation of how done he is. That's suspicion must have been growing for months already. Every time Elros had to publish another delay post on Patreon, every time he didn't sit down to write the second chapter, every time he even so much as looked at a calendar, he must have broken out in a cold sweat. In my first video, I already said that if he wanted to release the second edition in spring, meaning June 30th or earlier, then the manuscript would already have to be done in January, or otherwise he'd have yet another 4-month book publication. And here he was in January, barely having the outline of the first 8 out of 39 chapters. On November 9th, Elros wrote on Patreon that they'd share chapters 2 and 3 once completed, but those chapters were never uploaded at all, and even in November they were already months behind schedule, to an extent where even a Milo Winter would have to recognize that spring is just not possible anymore. And this is where I want to talk about the Alterlife production. Milo has already been writing poetry since senior year in high school, and some of the poems in Alterlife were already written in 2023 or 2024, but at least one was written when he was already in Finland, so after September 24th, 2025. The same applies to Sauli's illustrations. A lot of the paintings were made between 2016 and 2022, but there was also a lot of original artwork too. So estimating how long exactly the illustrations would have taken is quite difficult, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't at least several weeks, if not months. Just for thoroughness' sake, the production of Alterlife is also a violation of Milo's Type C Schengen short stay visa, because you're not allowed to work on a tourist visa. Like, if you're on holiday and your boss is being a dick, then answering a couple phone calls and emails is not going to get you in any trouble, but producing an entire book is. And Milo has already been reported to Finnish immigration for exactly that. But what I care about here is not the visa violation or even the poetry, but the author's note. Specifically, this paragraph. I decided to publish my poetry at the foot of my creative gravestone, my answer to the artist's wrath I found walking through a cemetery in Oslo at midnight in the snowy Nordic valley I am in right now. Translated, by the time Milo published Alterlife, the World of Guardian was already dead to him. Based on the Oslo weather data, we can actually estimate that this paragraph was probably written in late November. He already knew that the spring release wouldn't happen anymore and still had Sauli make advertisements for it and claimed that he was still definitely working on the second edition when he had already given up. He hadn't just given up, he had already moved on. In his poem Arctic Circle of Life, he already mentions a completely different fantasy series he had started to brainstorm in Finland. And when I say brainstormed, I mean assemble Pinterest boards which have just coincidentally disappeared from his account a couple weeks ago when people started noticing them. But Milo hadn't just known the second edition wasn't going to happen in late November. We already know that by the time High Disturbance came out on November 10th, Alter Life was already in production because in High Disturbance, Milo already calls himself a poet and the webpage already uses several artworks that were later used in Alter Life. Even this burning wolf here that didn't make it into the collection was probably still originally conceived for the canine and the core, but was probably scrapped because it's composed for a full 2-page spread and the layout just didn't pan out that way. And even before High Disturbance, Elrose already uploaded a Patreon post on October 7th where she already says that Milo is working on a creative non-fiction and Milo admits that he's struggling with the second edition, which is perfectly normal and human, by the way, but I want you to remember that that means that Milo already knew, or at the very least had reasonable basis to believe that the spring release wasn't going to happen as early as the first week in October. And still, for 5 months, Milo didn't just keep up the pre-order listing, didn't just not notify his customers that the product had already gone down the drain, he repeatedly insisted that the second edition was still coming and even had advertisement for it made, trying to get even more pre-orders. All the while he spent a significant amount of his time in Europe hiking all over Scandinavia, not even seriously trying to edit the Age of Scorpius, and set up a company construct that's supposed to protect him from financial liability. This is just wire fraud again. Well, I wish him luck with the IRS now, but that leaves one question. Why did so many people pre-order his book in the first place? Well, one aspect was the book's premise. There's a lot of people into zodiacs, and a fantasy world based on that has the automatic self-insert bonus that Harry Potter and Divergence also had. But a zodiac-based fantasy dystopia where your zodiac sign completely determines your life, profession, and legal status is such a good idea that I kinda want to steal it. Because any society built on something as arbitrary and unchangeable as your birthday is automatically dystopian. That dystopia probably wouldn't manifest itself in nation building the way that the world of Guardian does, since zodiac signs aren't inherited, but that only gives you even more potential for conflict. If all farmers are Taurus, then what happens to the farm if a couple only has Virgos as children? Having a protagonist with the power of zodiac turning was also a stroke of genius, because if the whole world is built on something as unchangeable as your zodiac sign, then the power to change that factor would automatically cause conflict. When Milo came out as trans, I was actually very happy about that, because zodiac turning could have parallels to transitioning, including the discrimination. The Age of Scorpius also has something called the Scorpio Code, which is a set of laws that say that Scorpios are not allowed to show emotions, have friends, or fall in love. This sounds a bit silly because of the wording, but in practice that would mean that Scorpios are not allowed to have loyalties or react to unjust orders they are given. It is very easy to imagine a scene where our protagonist sees their friends get beaten up by other Scorpios and can't directly interfere, because then they would draw attention to themselves. Alternatively, it could be our Scorpio protagonist herself who gets the order to kill their friends and now has to pretend to be emotionless while arguing for their life. In the hands of a better writer, this could have worked. The second aspect to his success was Milo himself, but in order to explain that, I have to talk about somebody else first.
I'm Alex Astor. I wrote these books, and I am going to tell you how I went from being rejected by every single publisher to selling millions of copies and having movies made of my books. I've been writing books since I was 12 years old, and I have also been trying to get published since I was 12. So at 12, I learned that to get traditionally published, you need an agent, and to do that, you need to query. So this is the really cool thing about publishing that I learned when I was 12, is you do not need any connections to have your book published. The flip side of that is that when you have an industry that doesn't have all of these, I guess, barriers to entry in the traditional sense of like you need to know someone's agent or you need to know someone in the industry, what you get is very slow response times and you get very high rejection rates. So regardless though, I was 12 years old and my books were obviously really bad, but I was rejected by every single agent, and so I wrote another book. I wrote 6 different books between high school and then college, and then the day I graduated, I got my first agent, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm set, my dream has finally come true. Every single publisher rejected my book, and then suddenly I didn't have an agent anymore. So I wrote another book that everyone rejected, and then I wrote another book, and that became my first published book. It's a middle grade book. The series is called Emblem Island, but unfortunately that book came out in 2020 when a lot of the bookstores were closed, and in that first year, that book did not sell many copies. And then I also found myself without an agent because I kept writing and rewriting a book that I really believed in. And that book was called Lightlark. So without an agent, I decided I'm going to really try with this book. I wrote the book that I wanted to read. I put everything that I loved in fantasy into Lightlark. And so I rewrote the book over 6 months, and I queried agents again. So I cold emailed agents, and I was able to get a new agent. And we went on submission to publishers. Very quickly, a lot of rejections started to come through. I think at the end of the day, it was either 16 or 18 publishers rejected Lightlark. A lot of them really liked it, but they just didn't think that the book would sell well. And I just thought, like, I love this book. I'm writing what I love to read. There have to be like other people like me out there that would like this, right? And so I posted a video about it, basically like having my concept. And the next morning, it had over 1 million views and thousands of comments from people saying that they would love to read my book. And so I was able to use that interest to kind of overcome the fact that I didn't have a huge sales track at that point. And so I got the deal for Lightlark. And at that moment, I knew, okay, I've been trying for over 10 years to get published and nothing had worked at that point. Until that video. Like, that video was really what set me apart and what had people kind of believing that my work could find an audience. And I told myself, okay, this is your chance. And so I posted every single day, multiple times a day for 1.5 years.
Alex Astor is the author of the best-selling Lightlark series. Just like Milo, and around the same time even, she gained a lot of online success by advertising the premise of her book on TikTok, built up a large audience, and then used that audience to get a foot into the publishing industry. The difference is that she succeeded where Milo failed. Alex already had experience publishing another fantasy series, whereas Milo only had previous drafts of the Age of Scorpius. Alex already had found an agent for Lightlark based on her writing, whatever your opinion on that may be, whereas Milo had to build his audience to even get an agent in the first place. Alex built her audience in order to convince publishers to accept her submissions. Milo never went on submission in the first place. And I really hope you like both of their faces, because they are the future of the publishing industry. You see, the entire global book market runs on cross-subsidization. 90% of books don't sell 2,000 copies, and the average book actually only sells 300 copies. That is not very profitable. The reason why the publishing industry as a whole still exists is because certain other books, your Stephen Kings and Colleen Hoovers, sell extremely well, and they keep the entire company afloat. This system is incredibly vulnerable and can only survive under 2 conditions. One is that the unprofitable side of the market still has to be as profitable as possible. The second condition is that you need these guaranteed bestsellers. It is not a secret that publishers actively approach celebrities and influencers, offer them a sweet book deal, and then turn around, sell paperback, audiobook and translation rights, book interview venues, and kickstart the marketing machine before said celebrity even had the chance to hire their ghostwriter. In this kind of market, already having a following that you can rely on as your customer base is an indispensable advantage. Even though self-publishing authors may be outside of this system, they are still beholden to the same factors that created the system in the first place, namely that most books don't get bought and publishing is expensive. So if you want to make your living as an author, then you have to figure out a way to advertise your book, both to publishers as well as directly to the audience. The result is a system that breeds authors whose careers are built on hype around books that don't exist yet. Milo and Alex didn't build an audience based on their writing, they built hype around vague ideas, trope lists, and Pinterest boards. At that point, they're not even bookfluencers, they're draftfluencers. They're not selling you a book, they're selling you the idea of a book. And since they don't advertise themselves based on their writing, they have to fall back on self-mythologization. The best story that Milo ever told was not that of his protagonist Rika Spring, but that of the author AuDHD Winter, the story of a child prodigy with an elaborative fantasy world that they spent years writing. They find an excited online audience and they actually get an agent that's gonna get them published, but then the traditional publishing industry strikes back, their agent betrays them while their country marches face first into fascism. But will our hero give up? No. They know that their story deserves to be read, and despite returning to a completely different online landscape and failing to raise a Kickstarter, they keep working on it, pick up a second job to raise the money, hire editors and artists, and it pays off because people do care about the book and pre-order 7,000 copies of it, and now it's finally here. This is exactly the kind of story that the online book sphere would naturally be drawn to. After years of complaints about gatekeeping in the publishing industry and lack of diversity, here comes a young, queer, neurodivergent author with a passion for writing and a best-selling debut novel. In fact, a lot of Milo's audience were fellow young writers looking up to his success, and back when the book wasn't out yet, they could project their dreams onto him. What made Milo special was the extent of his hype, not his conduct. There's an entire online ecosystem of writers trying to advertise books that haven't even been written yet, applauding each other for self-publishing trash. Milo is a bad writer, and he's a dime a dozen. I just did a 1-minute scroll to find B-roll footage, and I found a lot, but decided not to use any of it because A, I don't want to be the one kicking off the next booktube wave, and B, a lot of these authors are high school students, just like Milo was when he originally tried publishing the Zodiac Turner. It is very fun to yell at Milo because the entire disaster around the Age of Scorpius was incredibly preventable, but a book like the Age of Scorpius by someone like Milo was inevitable, and heed my words, it will happen again. All you need is a writer who self-publishes a bad book, can't take criticism, and has a lot of eyes on them. So, where does this leave us? Well, my next video's topic has already arrived in the mail. This time it is not going to be book talk related because I have no intention of staying a drama channel, though it's been a lot of fun and I want to give special thanks to fellow Tumblr users Fatbird, Soul Mama and RR Laurentian for uncovering and helping me research a lot of details in this video, as well as Jay from the English Club podcast for helping me sort through some of the poetic terms in the last video. I'm gonna sign off now because at this point I've been yapping into a microphone for 2.5 hours now and I'm getting dizzy. I hope all of you have a gentle spring and I'll give the last word to Max Niedermeyer.
Da das Thema dieser Unterhaltung ja Verleger und Autor ist, möchte ich einmal den jüngeren Zuhörern, den jüngeren Dichtern sagen, Verleger sind keine Wohltäter und können keine Wohltäter sein. Wenn einer 6 Gedichte geschrieben hat, kann er nicht erwarten, dass ein Verleger oder ein Staat oder eine Stadt ihn nun jahrelang erhalten. Das ist unmöglich. Und wenn ich den jungen Schriftstellern in dieser Richtung noch einen Rat geben kann oder eine Moral auf den Weg geben kann, so würde ich sagen, spät ankommen. Spät ankommen bei sich selbst, spät ankommen beim Erfolg, spät ankommen bei den Banketts und den Akademien, abwarten, was aus einem wird. Nicht nach 6 Gedichten, nicht nach 12 Gedichten denken, die Welt horcht auf. Das ist ein Standpunkt, den man ja in den Briefen ich auch immer wieder sehe. Sie schicken 2 Gedichte und nun denken sie, man wird verblüfft sein über diese Genialität. Das ist nicht der Fall.